All right. Well, hi, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar that's going to be all about teaching vocabulary and background knowledge and comprehension. And I'm going to introduce our fabulous speaker for today in just a minute. But before we do that, I wanted to take a chance to share with you all a little bit about Listenwise. So my name is Ava, and I'm the marketing director at Listenwise, and I want to share with you a little bit about our product that also Hannah is going to be sharing about later in her presentation and how she might use it in addition to other things that she's going to be covering today. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. So who are we? So some of you might be familiar with Listenwise, others might not be, but we are a listening product that has recently been doing a lot more than just listening. We're all about using podcast lessons to teach academic language and content together. We have standards aligned content and curriculum aligned content, and we've also got teachers guides. So the goal is really to make it as smooth and easy as possible to share this with your students, to get them access to this great content, and to teach it without a lot of pre-work done by you, but it's still just as rigorous as you would want it to be. So I'm going to take a little bit of a dive into this, but I'm not going to spend too much time on it, just to give you all a taste. Like I mentioned, we're going to do a little bit of a peek into what the product looks like. So this is what you might see if you're signed up under Listenwise. We do have free trials, and I'll be mentioning that in a little bit. So when you look at our lessons, we have lots of different lessons, and you can see here that there's different content areas like science, social studies, ELA, and also ELD and ESL, if that's what you teach. And there's lots of different ways to search and find exactly what you want, the right grade levels, the right ELP levels, all those kinds of things. So here's just a quick glimpse at some of the stuff we have going on. Very high interest content, including this new one that I'm showing here of keeping secrets when your parents are spies. That's a story based on a new graphic novel that came out. It sounds fascinating, and I need to listen to it right now. This is a glimpse of what it's going to look like when you're into the content itself. So this is about our Egyptian animal mummies, which is another really fun story that we have. You can see the introduction at the top, how you can assign a quiz and create an assignment. You can share this or favorite this. Below this, it says listen to the story, and you can listen to the podcast there. And below that, which I wasn't able to share with you in the screenshot, but you would actually have the transcript ready to go. And students can read along, and it sort of lights up along the way, kind of in a karaoke type style while you're listening to the podcast. And as I mentioned, we have ELD supports on all of our lessons. We also have ELD specific lessons. So we have an ELD lesson library. That's what you see on the left. And it corresponds with a Gen Ed lesson that we have in Listenwise as well. And there's a little link between those two different things. And I won't get into it now, but we're going to send you these slides and a recorded presentation afterwards, so you're able to look at this more in depth to see what those differences are. And this is an example of what the lesson might look like if you're teaching an ELD lesson and some of the in-lesson supports that we have. So on the left, you can see the video that helps build background knowledge. We have at least one video, possibly several videos for each lesson. On the right, you can see the embedded language supports, and you could actually do translation of the entire interface into English or Spanish. Currently, we're working on other languages. And you can see how the podcast shows up, the translation, and then the translation of the questions that are part of it. And this is really cool. We have a text help toolbar that you can use on any of our lessons, and it does a bunch of different things. It has a visual dictionary, so you can highlight a word that you don't know, and you can click on it, and it'll show you a graphic of what that would look like. So if it's the word kick, you'd see a picture of somebody kicking something or something along those lines. You can also translate into one of 15 different languages that we have. It's actually 15 plus, I think it's 17 right now. So that your students can do translation on the go if there's something that they stumble upon and need a direct translation of. That's something that they can source themselves. There's also just regular dictionaries, word dictionaries in there, lots of different great tools that you can use to help you access the content. And even better, we have ways to track students' progress, to see how they're doing, that breaks down how students are performing with the different areas of listening that you would want to assess, and how they're doing with their assignments in general. So that's all in there. Okay, about Lingolift. So we have a brand new product that we just launched. It's hard to believe, but I think it was this past year. It feels like it was a long time ago, but we just launched a new product that is all about newcomer and emergent multilinguals. And Lingolift is related to Listenwise, though they are two different products. And Lingolift, like I mentioned, is just focusing on interactive video lessons to help with a watch, learn, speak sequence to get students hopefully on target with survival, social, and grammar and academic language as soon as possible. So really quickly, I want to show you what Watch, Learn, Speak looks like. This is the watch portion. So this would be part of a collection on weather. The students would be prompted to first watch this short video. Then once they've watched it as many times as they want to, they're going to learn the words and they're going to type in the missing words. And that way you can assess, whether they understood what they were listening to, and also it'll catch any kind of grammar or spelling mistakes and things like that. And they can have as many times as they need to correct their mistakes as well. So it's not just you got it wrong, move on. They have a chance to keep practicing at it. And then finally, we have the speak portion, which has speech recognition. So your students can listen to what they're supposed to speak what's in the video, and then afterwards they can also listen to their recording and see if they want to improve it, so they can have as many opportunities as they want to get it, to refine it and get it better. And also you as a teacher can then listen to how they sounded. Like if you wanted to assign this as homework, later on you could listen to what the recording sounded like and hear how your students are doing. And we think that Listenwise and Lingolift are better together. When we have all three of these things working together, we're able to meet all of our students' needs, which is the goal. So here's a graphic, which again, you can look at more in depth later, that explains how Lingolift, our ELD lesson library, and our Gen Ed lessons all work together and could be used simultaneously in a classroom, depending on your students' levels. Speaking of which, this is an example of what that might look like. So if you're teaching about science and having to do with the moon, for example, you could go to our Lingolift academic lessons for your newcomer and your emergent multilinguals, and you could show them the space collection. For the ELD lesson library, we have a Phases of the Moon ELD version with extra supports. And then Gen Ed, we have the same lesson, but just the Gen Ed version of it. And we also have on the right some more examples of space and earth science that you could kind of add into that. So that is our very, very quick deep dive into what Listenwise and Lingolift are all about. And the good news is that today, right after this, or maybe tomorrow, you can sign up for a free trial to try out Listenwise yourself with your students tomorrow as soon as possible. You can do that yourself, just self-serve option right on our website, and where I put the little arrow, it says free trial. For a bundled trial of Listenwise and Lingolift, we would like you to go ahead and click request a quote. So you'll go to where it says Lingolift, drop down, request a quote, and you can get connected to someone on our team who can help set you up with a bundled version and answer any questions that you might have. So that is all I have to share with you today. And I'm going to be passing it over to the fantastic Hannah Irion-Frake. I hope I said that right.
You did. Yeah.
Oh, fantastic. Okay. Also known as Mrs. If, and she's going to be leading the rest of the conversation. And then at the end, as promised, we will have Q&A. So if you have any questions, drop them in the chat and we'll get to them later. Take it away, Hannah.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for giving that overview for everyone. I definitely recommend checking out a free trial of Listenwise. I have used it with students before and am a huge fan. So it's a really, really cool platform, and I promise your kids will be into it. So, but thank you all of you for being here today with us live, and thank you to anyone who's hopping on to the recording in the future. Thank you to Listenwise for having me, giving me this really cool platform to share about topics that I really love talking about. So without further ado, we'll get into it. I am Hannah Irion-Frake. My students do call me Mrs. If, because If is a lot easier than Irion-Frake. I'm currently a K-5 literacy coach in a public school district in Pennsylvania. This is my first year in this literacy coach role. I came from a classroom teacher position. So prior to being a literacy coach, I taught for 9 years in third grade. And then before that, it was 7 years in second grade. So even though I'm in that literacy coach position, I am very fresh out of the classroom and have a lot of classroom ideas to share with you. And it was in my third grade classroom that I used Listenwise quite a bit. I am also the LETTERS facilitator for my school district. If you have not heard of LETTERS before, it stands for Language Essentials for Teachers of Reading and Spelling, and it's wonderful professional development about how our brains learn to read and write and spell. And so I highly recommend it. If you have a chance to do LETTERS training with a good facilitator, you will probably get hooked as well. I'm also the Acadience mentor for my district, which means that I love Acadience and assessments and data, but that's not the topic of tonight, so I won't stray into assessment. And then I always like to be upfront that I am a self-proclaimed science of reading nerd. So I love learning, talking about all things science of reading related. I did share my contact information. I'll share it again at the end. I definitely encourage you to reach out if you have any questions or want to continue the conversation. I'm most active on Instagram at Reading with Mrs. If, but I did include my email and my website there as well. So with our time together tonight, I want to really dive into some practical activities that you'll be able to use in your classroom, activities that you can use with Listenwise and Lingolift, and activities that might fit really well with just text that you're reading or other things that you're doing in your classroom. And all the things that I share can be kind of shifted up or down depending on the grade level you're working with. So I really tried to cover a wide range of grade level activities. So we will talk a little bit about vocabulary and background knowledge and comprehension, and then hopefully have a little bit of time at the end for us to get into some Q&A. So if you know me at all, or if you've ever been to a webinar that I've done before, you know that I very rarely have a webinar without Scarborough's reading rope kicking us off. And I like to put it here because it sort of sets the tone and gives us a framework for making sure that we are really thinking about research and best practices with the things that we do related to reading comprehension in this case. If you are already familiar with Scarborough's reading rope, this will be a short little overview. And if it's new to you, it'll be just a little taste of something that you could dive into a little bit deeper. So Scarborough's reading rope is just a really nice graphic to help us represent all of the things that go into becoming a skilled, proficient reader. On the right side of the graphic, you can see a very tightly wound rope, and it's labeled skilled reading. And that, of course, is our end goal of reading instruction over the elementary years and beyond. We want to develop students who are skilled, fluent, accurate readers who understand what they read. But there's a lot of things that go into that. And you can see that by sort of the strands of the rope that are weaving together to get to the right side. On the bottom left, we have word recognition skills. Those are really the skills that students need to be able to decode and to read the words on the page, being able to connect sounds to letters, understanding spelling patterns, and being able to be really fluent and automatic with your reading. Those are not the skills we're going to be talking about tonight, but they are foundational skills that we're sort of expecting students to develop to automaticity over time. We are going to focus more on the red strands that are on the top left of the screen, and those are our language comprehension strands. And that's just our ability to really understand what's happening in our language that we will eventually be reading in text. And so we're going to dive into the strands of background knowledge and vocabulary. We're going to look at the other three strands there together as sort of a general comprehension discussion, talking about language structures, which is, for our case, syntax. Verbal reasoning, we'll be talking a little bit about making inferences. And then literacy knowledge, we're going to dive into text structure. And so we're really working on bringing all these things together to help our students become better readers and better comprehenders. And the nice thing is Listenwise and Lingolift are just really excellent tools for helping students with both listening comprehension and reading comprehension. So we'll dive in now right into vocabulary. We'll get started there. Loosely defined, we can just describe vocabulary as all of the words in a language that we use to understand and to communicate. But more specifically, in a classroom, we'll think about vocabulary as an individual's mental dictionary of words that includes both their receptive and expressive vocabulary, the words that they understand, the words that they're able to use. And I included on this slide a favorite quote of mine from Nancy Hennessy, just to capture the idea that an individual's level of understanding of vocabulary sort of emerges over time as they have more experience, as they have more instruction with words. They just kind of learn vocabulary at a deeper level over time. And so Nancy Hennessy describes that as learning the meaning of words in bits and pieces. And I think it's nice to capture that idea that vocabulary isn't like a one and done thing. We're trying to build that in our students over time. And so if we look closely into kind of what the research is telling us about vocabulary, there's a couple really important takeaways that we can talk about. First is that word meanings are interrelated to each other. Knowing the meaning of a word is usually related to knowing other words. Word knowledge is stored in semantic networks in our brain. And if you want to see a really cool website that sort of showcases this idea of semantic networks, I linked it here on this slide. It's some work done by the University of California, Berkeley, where they explore different parts of the brains that activate when people read different words. It's a very fascinating, nerdy website. Definitely one to check out if you're into vocabulary. But it's a really important understanding is that if we know that words are connected to other words in these semantic networks, we want to be choosing activities that help us to make connections between words. And I'll share a couple of those with you very shortly. Another important thing that research tells us about vocabulary is that breadth, depth, and fluency all matter, and they're all relevant for comprehension. So breadth of vocabulary is just the size of someone's mental dictionary. How many words does that person recognize or know at any level of knowledge? Whereas depth is kind of that measure of how well does an individual know a word? Do they know its multiple meanings? Are they able to use it in their expressive language? And then fluency is just how quickly someone can access the meaning of a word or multiple meanings of a word. And again, all three of them are really important for comprehension. So we want to teach lots of words and have exposure. We want to teach some words really deeply, and we want to get kids using those words fluently. Vocabulary is also a really key contributor to comprehension. It's one of the most robust predictors of reading comprehension performance. And so it's just very important that our students are understanding the vocabulary in the texts that they are listening to and reading. And then finally, vocabulary and comprehension have a reciprocal relationship. And what I mean by this is initially, we are developing vocabulary through oral language opportunities. So listening to text, listening to our families talk, listening to the people around us. And that's helping to build up our oral vocabulary. And then when we get to the point where we're starting to learn how to read, we have this bank of vocabulary that's helping us with our decoding and our reading of text. And then once we become better readers, we actually expand our vocabulary through reading. So these things just kind of work back and forth. We're building vocabulary, learning how to read, doing a lot of reading, building vocabulary. So they're very reciprocal in nature. When it comes to learning words, experts estimate that our students enter school knowing about 4,000 to 5,000 words. And then when they graduate high school, they leave with about 40,000 to 50,000 words. And these are just conservative estimates. And when I see that, I think that's a lot of word learning. That's a really impressive amount of words that our students have to learn. And there is no way that they could learn that from direct teaching alone. So we need to have opportunities for students to be exposed to a lot of vocabulary just in their environment. And then we also need to be directly teaching vocabulary words to students. And so in a fairly obvious example of ways to help expose students to more vocabulary, maybe my most obvious example of the evening, Listenwise and Lingolift are very effective at exposing students to more vocabulary. We have these amazing podcasts and videos for students to watch within these platforms. and the vocabulary is just abundant. And they're listening to it. So they're getting that oral language exposure, which is wonderful. I always think the podcasts in general, I used to give my students some free choice and kind of open access to to Listenwise, and they would go in and choose what they wanted to listen to. And so they're picking high interest topics and listening to all of the rich discussions and vocabulary and building knowledge. And I just loved to use it that way. But I also would assign students specific podcasts that were related to topics we were learning about in our like core content subjects. So science and social studies units, or even a math or a reading unit, I would assign certain podcasts to help them really get exposure to vocabulary related to that topic. I want to share here these current event weird news podcasts that are on Listenwise that I just think are so cool for vocabulary. They're really short podcasts. I think they're like 30 seconds or less. And they actually feature certain vocabulary words. So you know exactly which vocabulary words are the focus of the podcast. And these would be amazing, like morning meeting listens, or giving older students some morning work to do with these, or sneaking them in during transition times. They're very interesting for kids, and the vocabulary is just really awesome. And I know that Ava mentioned that you'll get a copy of these slides after today, but I did link every like podcast that I reference and some other resources. So if you're like, ooh, I want to see that specific one, you can find it when you go into the slides. So now let's get into some actual direct, like some teaching, some activity ideas for using vocabulary, using Listenwise, or just vocabulary strategies in general in the classroom. So this first slide I have here for you is a explicit routine for introducing vocabulary. And so this is when we're directly teaching students a vocabulary word that we want them to know. This is a really student-friendly routine. You can pre-plan it as a teacher and use it to sort of, before reading or before listening, get kids familiar with the vocabulary words. There's 5 steps to it. You start by discussing the word itself, talking about its phonology, its orthography, and its morphology. So what does the word sound like? How is it spelled? Are there any relevant morphemes? Then give kiddos a student-friendly definition of the word. Then use the word in some sentences, talk a little bit more about it, give the kids some context. Then you ask some yes or no questions before having kids use the word themselves in either speaking or writing. And I have an example for us to do together. I'll walk you through one so you can kind of see how it sounds. So this is a Kid News podcast called Stink Bug Invasion that is available on Listenwise. And this is just a 3-minute podcast all about stink bugs and how they're an invasive species. I think this would be a fantastic podcast if you're doing a science unit on like invasive species, or if you are like me and have ever had a stink bug flying around your classroom and you have kids just in complete chaos, you can teach them a little bit more about where those stink bugs came from. So the word I picked is invasive. That's an important vocabulary word for understanding this podcast. And so in our first step, we would start by saying the new word. I'd ask students to say it with me. And we talk about how it's spelled. So ideally, I would at least write it on the board and maybe have them write it with me, spell it together, invasive. Talk about how invasive has 3 syllables, and the syllables help us with how to pronounce it and how to spell it. Our first syllable is closed, and so we see that short I and in. The second syllable is an open syllable, and as expected, it makes a long A sound, they. But the third syllable, although it appears to be a vowel consonant E syllable or a silent E syllable, it's actually not following the rule we'd expect for a silent E syllable. It's not saying a long I sound. It's not invasive. It's invasive. And so that tells me that that E at the end is probably there because we have a rule where we don't end English words in the letter V. And so talking about those spelling patterns with kids is going to help them remember the word, the pronunciation, and the spelling of that word. Second step, I'm going to give kids a student-friendly definition. I'd say invasive is an adjective that describes something that has invaded a place or has gone somewhere where it doesn't belong. Then I'll say a little bit more about the word. I might ask students things like, can you hear that word invade in the word invasive? those words are connected to each other because they both have something to do with going into a place where you're not supposed to be. We hear that word invasive a lot when we describe plants and animals that live somewhere that they didn't used to live. We call them invasive species. It's kind of the opposite of being a native species. A native species is a plant or animal that's always lived in a certain place, whereas invasive species have invaded that space. So I'm just giving them a little more context for that word. Some yes or no questions I might ask kiddos. If I brought a plant from another country and planted it in my backyard, could that be invasive? And they would say yes. I think another one might be, white-tailed deer have always lived in Pennsylvania. Are they invasive? And while they might invade your garden, they're not an invasive species. And then the last step would really depend on my student's skill level. I might have them talk about an invasive species they know of, or just have them use that word in a sentence, maybe just orally or in writing. So a very explicit way to introduce new vocabulary to students. The next three activities I have for you are vocabulary practice activities. And these are meant to help increase exposure to vocabulary words that you're teaching students directly. So we're trying to increase that fluency of using words. Typically, about 10 to 15 exposures are needed for acquisition of vocabulary. So this is some of the way you can do that. I grabbed a podcast here. Actually, I think this one is a Lingolift lesson that's all about ecosystems. And so it goes through the vocabulary of plains and rainforests and tundras. And then from there, we're going to create a word map, also maybe known as a Freyer model or a semantic map. There's lots of word cloud. There's lots of names for these. But the idea is we're talking about examples and non-examples and the word structure and things that we might be confused with and what we might find there. And so we're creating this sort of map all about the rainforest in this example you see here. And we might do another one for plains and another one for tundra. And I could even imagine like a big anchor chart in your room with these different vocabulary words posted. So now we've got kids using all of these ecosystem vocabulary words to discuss different places around the world. And then this Lingolift lesson gives them even more exposure to those words as well. Another activity that I really love to do with vocabulary is called Shades of Meaning. Sometimes I've heard it called gradable antonyms. So this is, you can see this podcast here is that weird news one again. This one is about clicky flamingos, all about how flamingos kind of group themselves by traits, and that's how they make friends with each other, which gave me a lot of high school, middle school vibes as well. But I thought, what a great short podcast to get students talking about the idea of character traits, a very common skill in ELA classrooms. And so we've hooked them in a little bit. We've talked about this vocabulary word trait, and now we can brainstorm a whole list of traits that we might see in characters, like the ones you can see on these sticky notes. And then I challenge students in partners or groups to list them from the most positive to the most negative trait. And so they're using the words and having these really rich discussions about like which ones are better or worse. And so there's a lot of conversation happening. And I always do these with sticky notes because it makes it really easy for kids to move them around. So a fun activity. And then the last vocabulary activity that I wanted to share with you is called Select and Connect. Sometimes I hear it called Partner Chatter, but this is an excellent activity for getting students talking and using vocabulary. And then also just a really great activity if you're listening to a short podcast that is chock full of vocabulary for them to be using that vocabulary in context. So I think this one lends itself really well to podcasts, but also just to like units and topics where you have a lot of vocabulary to cover. So this is a podcast about plate tectonics and how mountains are formed. And so I've created 2 columns of vocabulary words. And the select and connect part is that they pick a word from each column and have to explain how those words are connected to each other or use them in a sentence together to kind of demonstrate their understanding of those words. So I have 2 examples just so you can see kind of what it might sound like. One is tectonic plates are moving underneath the Earth's crust. And the other one is when magma moves up through tectonic plates, you could get a volcano. So if a student is using words that way, I really know they understand the vocabulary that we've discussed. So that's it for vocabulary. We're going to slide into background knowledge and kick it off with one of my favorite statements to make whenever I'm talking to somebody about background knowledge and how important it is for comprehension. And that is that you have to know something to learn something. There has to be some knowledge there for new knowledge to stick to. And Dr. Marilyn Adams gives this really awesome analogy of background knowledge being like the Velcro that's needed for new learning. So you have your prior knowledge, and then anything new sort of sticks to that and has a place in your brain, just like Velcro. So I love that analogy of how important background knowledge really is. So if we kind of look at what the research is telling us, we know that knowledge contributes to learning. Like I said, you have to know something to learn something. It's really, really important for helping you to make connections, remember new information, make inferences as you're reading and listening. So we want to spend time making sure kids kind of have that prerequisite knowledge before they read something new. Good news is educators can have a lot of influence on students' background knowledge. They can identify what do students need to know in order to be successful when they read or listen to this text. And as a teacher, you can plan those activities. And I would argue that that's one of the more fun parts of teaching, is to be able to plan all these really fun activities for kids to do before you get into the text that are really authentic and hands-on. And then the third point to share is just that there is a lot of overlap between vocabulary and background knowledge. In fact, the more you learn about them, the harder they are to sort of separate. And I would even argue that vocabulary is kind of a type of background knowledge. So in order to talk about your knowledge, you have to have vocabulary to do it. So they get very intertwined with each other. So some of the vocabulary activities and background knowledge activities are sort of like two birds, one stone. So to help kind of organize some of the ideas about background knowledge, I want to share this chart that comes from the work of Nancy Hennessy. This is her ABCs of background knowledge, and she sort of organizes it into 3 components to really be thinking about. And it's the most helpful way I've come up with to sort of talk about all the parts of background knowledge. So the A stands for activate and assess. And this really serves 2 purposes: helping educators kind of identify what do students already know about a topic. And then it also prompts students to be thinking about those things as they get into the text that they are working with. So we see that in like anticipation guides. I'm going to show you one of those on the next slide. Questions and prompts ahead of time, our good old classic KWL, if you're someone who's a fan of those, or charts where students talk about what they know, what they want to learn. And then, of course, visual images that sort of get kids thinking about certain topics. The B stands for build, and that is the part where you are directly teaching any key background knowledge that students need before they read or listen. I always have one word of caution there, though, is you want to be very mindful that you are not teaching content that they're about to learn in the text that they're going to read or listen to. You want to think about what is the author assuming that these students already know before they read this, and that's the background knowledge that you're going to focus on building. You can do this with other texts and read alouds, different hands-on experiences, virtual field trips, authentic artifacts, introducing vocabulary words. So you're seeing that overlap a little bit. And then the C stands for connect. And this is the idea that as we're learning new things, we want to make sure we're intentionally connecting it back to our knowledge and our understanding of a topic that we're reading about. And so instructionally, this kind of looks like going back to the things you did in activating and building and just making those connections really explicit and obvious for students and giving them chances to talk about it or even write about it if they have the skill level. So I want to share with you one strategy for each of the ABCs. So the first is activate, and that is an anticipation guide. And I think that these work really nicely within kind of the podcast setting, but especially within these cool debate podcasts that they have in Listenwise, where kids are going to get ready to argue like their perspective on a particular debate. So in this anticipation guide, I just have some true false statements before we listen to the debate. Should scientists resurrect extinct species? And it's all about woolly mammoths and the potential to kind of clone them through elephants. It's kind of a fascinating topic. But ahead of it, I can ask students things like, true or false, scientists can bring extinct animals back to life. Well, now I've got their interest piqued because they're probably thinking of Jurassic Park. True or false? Woolly mammoths are related to elephants. That's a really important connection for this, so I want them thinking a little bit about elephants. True or false? Scientists should test cloning on animals. And we may have to explain what cloning is in that case, but it's setting them up for a really interesting debate as they go. For the build, this is perhaps another very obvious example when we're thinking about podcasts and the opportunity to listen to podcasts with students. But there are so many excellent podcasts that will help build background knowledge for students before a text you need to read or before a unit of study. And in Listenwise, they have these collections set up. I found one here that's all about life cycles for the elementary level. And what a powerful way to get kids sort of thinking about life cycles as you're about to enter into a science unit on the topic. One caveat, like I mentioned earlier, if any of these animals are ones I'm going to specifically read about in my unit, I might skip that podcast because I don't want to give them all of that information ahead of time. I want them to access it through the unit. But these ones are really very interesting. And then I, of course, had to include some of the fun ways that you can also build background knowledge if you were doing a life cycles unit, and that is by bringing in animals or plants to watch the actual life cycle in real life. So butterflies, tadpoles, I've done ladybugs before. I've even found praying mantis uthicas to watch. Those are cool, but not if you don't like lots of little bugs. And then plants are a really easy one to do. So bean seeds are very successful to grow in like a plastic bag so kids can watch the life cycle happening. So I get a little excited thinking about these things because this is really the fun parts of teaching is getting into that science and social studies content and teaching kids stuff. Next up is the connect part of the ABC model. And for this one, I have what I like to call my low budget KWL because I was super guilty of never going back and doing the L part of the KWL. We would talk about what we knew, we'd ask questions about what we wanted to learn, and then we would never come back to it at the end of the unit. And I like this one because it's a little more immediate and connected. So the idea is that before reading something or before listening to a podcast, you make a bunch of predictions about what you think you're going to hear or discover. And then right afterwards, you record the connections or the things that you've learned. And so this podcast is all about traveling into the deep ocean. So ahead of time, we might talk about what do you think is in the deep ocean? And I've got some like serious suggestions you might hear from kids or silly ones you might hear. And then afterwards, we can come back and say, is that what we discovered? Or did we learn something new? Or did we have our understanding corrected or changed in any kind of way? So if you're guilty of not doing the last part of a KWL, this might be a good one for you. So we'll slide now into the last kind of third of the topics for the webinar tonight. And that is comprehension. And I have to give a disclaimer before we go too far into comprehension to state that comprehension is super, super complex. I could probably do several webinars all about comprehension and still feel like we didn't get that far deep into it because it really involves a lot of different processes, and it's hard to see what's happening in students' heads when they're reading and understanding. It's just very complex. And so if you've ever felt like, oh, comprehension is a big task to tackle, it is. So that you should feel good. It's complex, and that's okay. As far as research goes, like I mentioned, comprehension is a very complex cognitive activity. We saw all the strands that go into it in the reading rope. I have a model here called the mental model that it shows all of these complex things that go into comprehending. It is very, very complex, for lack of a better vocabulary word. Research also tells us that comprehension is a process. It is not a product. And what I mean by that is it's a language process, a cognitive process. It is not just our ability to write an essay or our ability to fill out a graphic organizer. There's a lot of stuff happening in your head when you're reading and understanding and making connections. And that's comprehension. And while it's, we need comprehension products, we need things to grade in education, we wouldn't be able to get around that. We really want to nurture the process of comprehension when we're teaching students how to make sense of text or to think about the things that they're learning. So when we think about comprehension, we can think about some separate parts. We can think about the reader and all the things that they bring to the table. Their motivation, their interest, their executive functioning skills all impact comprehension. We can think about the text itself and how easy or hard it is to read. And that gets at this idea of surface code versus text base. The surface code is the literal words and phrases that you're reading, but we know that authors don't tell us everything. And there's this text base of like the unwritten parts you're supposed to infer and make sense of as the reader. And so how easy or difficult that is can impact comprehension. And the purpose for reading impacts comprehension. Are you skimming something? Are you reading for depth? Are you looking for a particular answer? Is it a text to just enjoy? And then all these things need to kind of be held in a student's working memory as they navigate this process of comprehension, which in and of itself is difficult. They're trying to pull in some information from long-term memory, all that background knowledge and vocabulary we just talked about. And through that, they're trying to come up with what's called a mental model, which is just sort of their understanding of what they've read. And so it's tricky. There's a lot to do there. So before I get into some brief examples of things that you can do to sort of support comprehension for students, I do just want to clarify everything I'm talking about is good to go for listening and reading comprehension, even though those two are different things. In the simplest sense, it's just the difference between whether you are listening to it or you're the one who's doing the actual decoding. In an instructional sense, kind of a big picture sense, we want to include listening comprehension for students, even as they're learning how to read, up until the point where they can read themselves and then start working on reading comprehension. And so just a quick way to say that is, don't wait to teach comprehension until kids can read. Practice comprehension in listening settings. And Listenwise and Lingolift make that very easy to do. They give you great content to listen to with kids who aren't reading yet on their own. So I am going to share 3 different activities with you here, but in kind of a different way. Because comprehension is so challenging, I'm just going to share 3 little tidbit activities that I like to do that I think help students with comprehension. One is related to text structure, one's related to syntax, and one is related to making inferences. Text structure is kind of like a roadmap for students. So if they understand the structure of how the text has been set up, they can anticipate what to expect or know what to look for, or how is information going to be organized. So helping students to understand text structure through things like graphic organizers can be very helpful for freeing up space in working memory so they can focus on content and not on like, how is the author organizing this information? So I have an example here of just using a story grammar graphic organizer with a podcast that comes from, it's on Listenwise, it comes from the Stories podcast, where they're actually telling the story of the boy who cried wolf. So this would be so great to use in like an early elementary classroom where they're hearing this like oral storytelling type of a podcast. Ahead of listening, I would probably review the different parts of story grammar on this graphic organizer and remind kids that, when we listen to a narrative story or a fiction story, we're listening for the characters. We're listening for the setting. We want to know what the problem and the solution are going to be in that story. And then as we listen, we can be looking for those things and like say, hey, there's the characters. Ooh, I bet this is the problem. And so we're sort of listening for those pieces as we go. And then afterwards, we can work together or in partners or independently, depending on the students, to fill in those parts of the graphic organizer. One thing I always loved to do is we'd fill it in together, and then I would give my students an opportunity to do some oral rehearsal where they're telling their partner the parts that we found. So they're doing a retell orally. And then with my third graders, especially, then I would say, now go write it because we did it together. You heard it. You got to say it. Now it's time for you to go write a little summary of what you listened to. And not to leave out any nonfiction graphic organizers, I did include just a couple of my favorite nonfiction ones. The same thing works for nonfiction. You can talk about, this is the text structure. These are the things I would be looking for from the author. As we listen, let's identify them, and then we can fill in the graphic organizer together and be set up to talk about it or to write a summary of it, which I think is a really great way to help kids navigate text in general. The next area I want to give you a little strategy for is syntax. So syntax is the grammatical and structural basis of our written language. So think like grammar and parts of speech and sentence structure and those kind of things. And really, when we think about text, our understanding is built one sentence at a time or could potentially be lost one sentence at a time. So it is very important to help kids understand how sentences are put together and parts of sentence and parts of speech and different types of sentences like simple, compound, complex. I won't get too far into that tonight. That is definitely one of my favorite topics to talk about. But I want to share with you this one syntax activity that you can do after a unit of study, after reading, after listening to a podcast. So I have an example here. This is one of the ELD lessons that has 2 different videos that you would watch before listening to the podcast about samurai warriors. So like right there, you can see some good background knowledge building before you get into the podcast. And then after reading, I would give students some kernel sentences, which are very simple sentences, and work with them to expand those sentences. So if I gave them a simple kernel sentence like samurai are warriors, we can use some of these question words and even this like sentence expander chart to add more details to that sentence to build up our comprehension of what that text was about. Another great kernel sentence from this particular podcast is they wore armor. There's a whole section about the armor of these samurai warriors and how special it is and all the characteristics. And so we can add all of that detail to that sentence and help them really understand how to build big, robust sentences. Bonus, this benefits comprehension and writing skill. So you're getting a little bit like a 2-for-1 there. And then the very last comprehension activity that I want to share with you has to do with making inferences. And I want to clarify between what is a local inference and what is considered a global inference, because both are very important for comprehension. Global inferences are probably what you are most familiar with when you think of inferences. And that's that idea of I take information from the text plus my background knowledge about that topic, and then I sort of infer what the author meant or infer what's going to happen. And that's a global inference where you're pulling in your background knowledge. We also have local inferences when we read, and that is having to make connections and inferences between sentences within the text. And so I have an example here of that. At the bottom, we have 2 sentences. Our family is having a party. The celebration starts at 10 o'clock. You as a fluent reader, you already know that celebration and party are talking about the same thing, but a young student might not. And so as a reader, you have to infer those connections between sentences and not be thinking that a party and a celebration are 2 totally different topics, to know that they're the same. So that's a local inference. We make inferences every time we read. It's a really important skill. And this idea of local inferencing is pretty difficult for kids and very difficult for students who don't have the vocabulary or the knowledge about what they're reading. I have for you one activity related to local inferencing, and that is this activity called pronoun reference. And all it is helping students to make connections between the nouns and the pronouns that replace them in text. And so this is a podcast about Ruby Bridges, but you would need the transcript to do this activity, which is such a nice feature. All of the Listenwise podcasts have a transcript that students can read along with, or you can take and do different activities with. And so in this one, it's even more confusing because it's set up as an interview. And so you have the person who's talking, and then they're using pronouns. And so it gets kind of messy about like, well, who's they and who's she and who are they talking about in this particular sentence? And so for this activity, you have students go in and circle all the pronouns in the text, and then draw arrows back to who that pronoun refers to. And I don't know what it is. My third graders loved doing this activity, but I think it was so helpful for them because pronouns can make things very ambiguous in text, and you have to know who it's referring to. And these kind of activities help kids to sort of transfer that to their own reading and listening and comprehension as well. So to sort of wrap things up for us, I know that I just shared a ton of information with you and went kind of fast and furious through some very complex topics. And, things that could be used with Listenwise and Lingolift, things that can be used with other texts and topics in your classroom. And so if you're anything like me, you're going, oh, I need to know where to learn more. And so I pulled out 3 resources that I thought might be helpful if you're a little bit nerdy like me. The first one there is Nancy Hennessy's book called The Reading Comprehension Blueprint. I know I mentioned her at least twice tonight. This book is just a gold mine for learning about comprehension processes and how to support students. And then in celebration of podcasts, I have 2 grown-up podcasts to recommend to you. One is the Knowledge Matters podcast, which is very focused on comprehension and background knowledge and vocabulary. And the other is Amplify's Science of Reading, the podcast, which has lots of excellent research-backed strategies and topics to dive into. So with that, I don't know if we have time for questions, or if there are any questions, I'll kind of pass it back to Ava for that.
Sure. Yeah, let's have some questions. If anybody has any questions for Hannah about anything we've talked about today, drop it in the chat. We'll give a little bit of a pause, practice wait time to see if anybody has any questions. It was funny because while we're waiting, I'll just share that I just wrote our newsletter that we're going to be sending out this weekend, and we featured several of the ones that you picked actually just by chance as our featured lessons for this coming month. So Samurai Warriors was one of them. Clicky Flamingos was another one that we're going to be sharing with people. So we also have one about a taco competition that's in LA. So another fun one to share with students.
As I was trying to find podcasts to like highlight some of these strategies, it was very easy to find podcasts that like fit with what I was trying to share. So I kept finding like, oh, that's so interesting. I love that topic. And I just get lost in the podcast.
There's a topic we regularly have staff meetings where someone will mention something and someone from our content team will say, we have a podcast on that. And so we'll share it with the team. But we have a question here from Melissa. What do you think is the best practice way to teach vocabulary in kindergarten, AKA for young children?
Yeah, I do think that the vocabulary routine that I showed you works well, even with young students. You just have to be very mindful of the examples you give and the language that you use to make sure that it's kind of within their developmental level. But most of it's really done orally and through like learning about topics or having words come up in stories that you're reading or listening to, and then getting kids to kind of talk about it. So I think that's really the key, because they're not reading it. Most kindergartners are not accessing vocabulary through reading. So it's really, really important that they're getting that vocabulary exposure through read alouds and conversation and learning about content. So hopefully that sort of touched on it. But I get kids to talk and then just really use those big words with them and give them a lot of support to understand what they mean.
I think that's all of our questions we have. Thank you everybody for joining us. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much to Hannah for sharing her expertise with us and getting us all excited and nerded out on the science of reading and some of the fun podcasts we have. And we hope everyone has an excellent rest of your evening. And you know where to find Hannah and you know where to find us. So with that, we'll just say thank you and good night, everybody.